Well, I started out as a playwright. Well, and I still am a playwright, although mostly I write novels now. But uh, when I was at the Yale Drama School with my fellowships, uh, I met Ron Sproat, and Ron was writing Dark Shadows, and it was a pretty heavy schedule, and so he asked me if I would write some of his scripts for him, and so I did, and they were done, but they were done with his name, and they seemed to like them, so that when at one time Dan asked me if I would just come and sit in on a story session when they were talking about where they were going to go and what they were going to do, and at the time the show was the Phoenix, when Laura was going to go up in flames when her 100 years was up and she would rise again, and that was when I began writing the scripts, and then I went on as my own name, and I stayed on. You know, it was a kind of a far out show, especially for the time in which it was done. I mean, we had a phoenix, we had a vampire, we had everything going on, but at its best, it always had something going on underneath it that people could identify with, whether they could identify it articulately or know that they were identifying it. And the primary example, of course, is Barnabas, because when I remember we were in one of the meetings, and Dan said, "I want a vampire for the kids for the summer," and we thought, oh God, now he wants a vampire, one of those days. And we thought, well, what are we going to do? I mean, he's going to bite somebody, and there'll be gore and everything like that, and that's one of the attractions for Dan, was the things of that nature. But what Ron and I did, I think before we got down the elevator from Dan's office that day, we decided that we would make him a reluctant vampire, that he didn't approve of himself doing these things that he had to do. I mean, it was his nature to do it, and that he was somebody who was yearning for love, but he had this compulsion. So that whole series, and that was when the show took off. And the reason that it took off is that what it was really all about was that it was about compulsive sex. And these kids and older people like that, they may not have identified it as such, but it was there, and it was a reality, and it gave those shows a reality. And that's what made it the great success that it was. It was always at its best when it had an underlying human identification. I think Dan is a genius. I think that he, first of all, that he conceived of this show, and that he was so willing and able to take it in directions for which he had nothing to refer to. It was all Dan Curtis, and his absolute professionalism, and I would say artistry too. I mean, that he always would say, make it more interesting, make it better. What can we do to make it better? What can we do let's do this, and he would come up with ideas, so that those long sessions that we would have in his office with Dan putting golf balls on the green carpet, and we're coming up with things, or struggling to come up with things like that. But there were always sessions about how can we improve it, how can we make it more interesting, how can we make it more exciting, how can we make it more suspenseful, and with him there, it made a big difference, because it was Dan driven all the way down the line. I mean, Ron and I might come up with an idea to make him a reluctant vampire, but we would never have had that idea if Dan hadn't said, okay, we're going to give the kids a vampire for the summer. Well, of course, the show took off, and we weren't going to, because they weren't going to kill off the main character, the person who had become, the center of the show. And that led them to try other things. And when David Selby came on, and Laura Parker, all those Angelique, all those other people came on. And later on, I did the show up through the Barnabas period, the main Barnabas period, and then I left to do a documentary for NBC, and then I came back later when the show had they were doing parallel time when I came back, and I thought that at that time, see, Dan was working on House of Dark Shadows at that time, so he wasn't there when we did our plotting and our blocking. That was when I was working with Gordon and with Gordon Russell and Sam Hall, and I thought we lost something without Dan, that we didn't have Dan there to really work with us. And I think my feeling, and this may not be applicable because it was a while back, but I think that we would lose what I was talking about before, that human element that people could identify with. And I think we chewed up plot too fast, and that we didn't really go deeper into the characters, that we relied too much on effects. Now this may be contradicted by the shows themselves, but that's my memory of it, was that I just wished that we had been able, or forced ourselves to rely less on the effects and more on the humanity of the characters. Because I think that's what, that was what made the show a success. I mean, it's true that it was cast in this, in this Gothic sense, and this Gothic surround and this Gothic imperative. But the thing that sustained it was the humanity of the people, that they were suffering. They were going through difficult times and responding in a certain way that people who watch it could identify with. And if you lose that, if there's nothing for them to really catch on and say, yes, I feel for that person. I know what it's like to feel that way, and I know what it's like to have to act that way, or to whatever it is. And I wonder, more than know, I can't say I know, but I wonder whether or not something was lost toward the end, toward the last year or so of the show, that was fatal. I thought the concept was fascinating. It was very interesting, because who got trapped? I can't remember who got trapped in parallel time, and nobody knew him. And we played off that he was there and he was discovering a plot. I think it was Barnabas, and he was discovering something terrible that was going to happen, and he had to get out before it happened, if I remember correctly. And it was fascinating to work on, because there you had what by then was a sympathetic character, Barnabas, and you put him in jeopardy. You put him in jeopardy of some kind where he's going to be destroyed, and it was fascinating, because it was something to hold on to get him out in time, and I think we did, before the calamity took place. One of the difficulties was not making him the center of the action at times, and having him play a secondary role, which is not what the show was. I think that I'm not all this clear on everything, but I wonder if we used the fact that he was a vampire as a way, and this sounds kind of crazy, but as a way that would allow him to help other people. You know what I mean? To find out some way there that would involve him as vampire, and that it would turn him good, because he did have sort of psychic powers. And I don't know if we utilized that to the degree that we might have, to keep him actively who he was, even when he was not the center of the action, but it became somebody else. Maybe it was a missed opportunity. It didn't occur to us at the time, and too late now. All these good ideas come too late. Here we are. It happens.